Welcome to this presentation for the Prisma Mental Health Summit 2022. We're going to be talking about the concept of Tselem Elokim, that human beings are created in the image of God. And we're going to look at how using that concept in what we teach and how we teach can help us to integrate social emotional learning and Jewish education in a way that makes social emotional learning Jewish, that makes Jewish education social emotional, and that fosters spiritual development, not just in our students, but in us as educators as well. So, when we talk about something being part of Jewish education, we have to ask ourselves, what does that mean? We all, presumably, everyone who's watching this, is part of a Jewish school that teaches a whole range of educational subjects. Some of them are strictly speaking Jewish, and some of them are not. And yet, it matters that the things that we teach that aren't Jewish are being taught at a Jewish school. There's something about the whole enterprise that makes it Jewish education as opposed to if they were taught someplace else. So, what does that mean? So, when I was thinking about that, that reminded me of a joke, you might have heard it, about Harry Abramowitz. Harry Abramowitz always dreams of making it big and fitting in just like everybody else. So he moves out to the suburbs, starts to make a lot of money, and he looks around. Everyone around him has a big house. He buys a big house. They have two cars. He gets the two cars. He's making it. He's just like them, except for one thing. He can't join the country club. They won't allow Jews. So he and his wife, they start to talk about it. They try to figure out what can we do. And they come up to a plan. They take etiquette lessons. They get a dialect coach and lose their Jewish accents. And they move out to a community where nobody knows them. They enroll their kids in the local prep schools. They are absolutely just like everybody else. And now is their chance. They're going to join the club. And he dreams of drinking cocktails by the pool, wearing their golf outfits, and having a grand old time just like everybody else. Calls up the country club and says, yes, I'd like to make an appointment to meet with the membership committee. And he and his wife get themselves all ready. They know how to answer every single question. And they come in and they're doing great. Where do your kids go to school? They go to all the right schools. They do all the right things. He's got the right job. They're perfect. And the last thing they ask Harry before they finish the interview is just one last thing. What religion are you? And Harry says, well, that's easy. We're Goyish. And the point is that for Jews, sometimes even when we're not trying to be Jewish, or even when we're trying to be not Jewish, there's still something Jewish about how we do it. That being Jewish is not just about how we do Jewish, but how we do things in general. And that's the concept that Vanessa Ochs was talking about in 2003 when she wrote a very influential article about Jewish sensibilities. And this concept of Jewish sensibilities became part of the discussion in Jewish educational circles all the way up until now. And there she describes what a Jewish sensibility is. And she says that whether or not we're observant, Jews still try to be good Jews. And something about what they mean when they think of trying to be a good Jew is universal. There's something Jewish about how we try to be that exists beyond halacha, that exists beyond strict laws or textual ideas, and that extends to how we interact with one another, how we make decisions, end of life decisions, and all other kinds of ethical questions. And she coined this term Jewish sensibilities that refers to particularly Jewish ways of thinking about what it means to be human, ways that guide and orient a person's actions and choices. Now, she included 10 different Jewish sensibilities. But I want you to think for a second about what you would include. What are some of the basic ideas that drive what it means to you to be a good Jew? Now, if we were doing this in a synchronous way, if we were all sitting together and learning, we could share our answers with one another. And I'd imagine that what would come out is that even though we are of different backgrounds, many of us would come up with very similar ideas. And that's because we share a heritage. That's because the way that we socialize our children, the way that we communicate our values and we act on our values comes from this shared heritage that is affected by the Torah, that is affected by our experience as a people. And here are just 5 of the things that she includes, and you'll see these are things that are kind of universal Jewish sensibilities. Being a mensch, being a really good person. We want to be a good person not just because that's a general idea, but because being Jewish means being a mensch. Honor, kavod. Dignity, being in the image of God, Tselem Elokim, which is the topic of this presentation. Pikuach nefesh, the importance of saving a life, the value of each human life. And tshuva, turning, that a Jewish life is a life that is examined, where there's introspection and change. And more recently, just a couple of years ago, there was a volume that came out discussing reevaluating Jewish identity. Jewish identity is a term that's been thrown around a lot, and so now it's 2019. We've been using this term for a long time. What does this mean? Is this something that still resonates and is an important goal? And one of the chapters there by Rabbi Jonathan Wucher uh, looked at applying the concept of Jewish sensibilities in education. And the idea is that Jewish sensibilities help give us a heuristic. By using the language of Jewish sensibilities, by talking about these things, we have a way of speaking about what Jewish is, broad human goals that we have. So, not just when it comes to Jewish education, specifically Jewish things, but that we have goals for our learners, that they be sensitive, moral, courageous human beings, that they are well developed. And I would say in this same context that we want them to be people who are well developed socially, that they have the capacity to interact with each other in a way that is empathic, that takes into account their own emotional needs and other people's emotional needs. Jewish sensibilities contextualizes learning within the broader goals of Jewish education, and it gives students a value-based lens that they can use to make choices later on in life as well. And so what that means is that Jewish education needs to include a language, needs to include references, and needs to, in Jewish education, we need to talk about these Jewish sensibilities explicitly, that so that our students know that when we want them to be good Jews, we're talking about these specific things. And so when it comes to social emotional learning, when we talk about them in the context of being a Jew, we're communicating to our students that the goal of being a good Jew includes SEL. When we talk about social emotional learning goals in the context of a Torah lesson, in the context of Parsha, in the context of a halachic lesson, that we're communicating the primacy of these Jewish sensibilities. Um, in those schools that are teaching Talmud and Mishnah and halacha lemaisa, practical halacha, that we don't just teach about ritual matters, we don't just teach about things that have to do with conceptual ideas, um, but that we teach specifically the things that we have as goals for our students as human beings, that we teach about things like midot, like character traits, that when we come across a lesson that is illustrated with one of the avot, with one of the characters that we have in the texts, that we bring it out explicitly. That when we talk about discipline and behavioral expectations, that we don't just talk about it as specific things like we expect that people are going to treat each other a certain way. When we talk, say, in a classroom and we're setting up the behavioral expectations at the beginning of the year, what are the rules for this classroom community? That we put it in the language of Jewish sensibilities so that we frame, once again, that social emotional learning and character expectations are Jewish ideas, and that being a Jew includes all of these things. And so, focusing specifically on Tselem Elokim, um, why this concept? So, there for reasons beyond what we can talk about just in this context, but the idea of Tselem Elokim, just looking at how it's presented, we see how the Torah understands the primacy of this. And we just think about, a human being is here in this world, is created by God. And we understand as Jews that being here in this world is a responsibility, that there's an intentionality to our having been created, to human beings being in this world. There's something that was intended by God to be carried out, to be accomplished by creating human beings, and that requires a certain commitment on our part. And just the way that it's presented communicates that. From the very beginning, in the description of the creation of the world in Bereshit, in Genesis, we see that when the Torah presents the creation of human beings, it says, Vayivra Elokim et ha'adam b'tzalmo, and God created humankind in the divine image. B'tselem Elokim bara'oto, in the image of God, in the template of God. Zachar nekeva bara'oto. So from the very introduction of humankind, we see that this is the template. The template of a human being is God. And we'll have to understand what that means. But there's something about being human, about what a human being aspires to in actualizing themselves, that is located there with God. That actualizing, becoming my best self, means matching this template of godliness. So to understand that a little bit, just a note, I'm using, there is a tradition not to write the name of God in written materials, and that is because of a fear of erasing the name of God, which is in halacha considered a desecration. But since these are digital materials and not meant for print, I've included the original text, including the correct spelling and sacred spelling of the names of God. But back to the topic. In Sefer Devarim, we see this pasuk that tells us that we are supposed to follow in the ways of Hashem, follow in the ways of God. Acharei Hashem Elokeichem telechu, v'oto tirau. go in the ways of God, be like God, and fear Him. That mitzvotav tishmoru, follow His mitzvot. Uvekolo tishmau, va'oto ta'avodu, listen to His voice and serve Him. Ubo tidbakun, and cling to Him, hold fast to Him. So number one, we see that there is this concept of going in the ways of God, and that is connected to the idea of cleaving to God, that the more we follow in the ways of God, the more that we're similar to God, the more we can become davek to God. But how do we understand that? And that is a question that is asked by the Gemara as well, by the sages in the Talmud. Is it possible to follow in the divine presence? And the Talmud brings another pasuk that says that God is Eish Ochla, God is a consuming fire. So it's not possible, certainly physical, to follow God. We're human beings. What does it even mean that we are following it in God's ways? What do we even know about the ways of God? And the answer is that going after the ways of God means emulating the midot of God. And that is because God reveals His midot to us, both in descriptions of His character traits, of His characteristics, and also in the descriptions of the things that He does. And this Gemara goes and explicates those things. Mahu malbish arumim. Just as God clothed the naked, Adam and Eve were naked in the Garden of Eden, and after the sin of eating from the tree of life, they realized they were naked. God clothes them with the katnus, or with the clothing of however that is to be interpreted. So just as God clothes the naked, so too we should clothe the naked. HaKadosh Baruch Hu biker cholim. God visits the sick. Avraham Avinu, Abraham, after performing the Brit Milah, is sitting petach ha'oel. He's sitting at the opening of his tent, and God Himself comes to visit Avraham Avinu. And incidentally, there we see also that Avraham Avinu forgoes this privilege of greeting the Shekhinah, of being there for God to perform the mitzvah of achnasat orchim, another model for us. But God visits the sick, so too we visit the sick. HaKadosh Baruch Hu nichem avelim, af ata nachem avelim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu kaver metim, af ata kavar metim. God comforts the mourners. God buries the dead, right? It brings a pasuk of after Aaron dies, God buries him on the side of the mountain. So all of these things that God does, we are to emulate them. And that's what the Torah means, say Chazal, say our sages, when it's telling us to follow in the ways of God. A similar Gemara to this is in Masechet Shabbat, where Abba Shaul says, Va'an Vehu. Literally, that means beautifying God. And the context is after Yetziat Mitzrayim, after the Exodus, the Jewish people go through the Yam Suf, go through the Red Sea after it's split, and they burst into spontaneous song. And one of the things they say about God is Zekeli, they pointing to God, this is the God that I can see, and I will beautify Him. So in the halachic context, that applies in one sense to beautifying the mitzvot that they do. But here the Gemara is looking at it in a different way. And as Rashi points out there, Lashon anvehu anivehu. They homiletically interpret that word anvehu as two separate words, ani vehu, which communicates this idea of emulating. I will be like him. Heve domelo. Mahu chanun v'rachum, af ata heye chanun v'rachum. Just as God is merciful and compassionate, so too we be merciful and compassionate. And Rashi finishes by saying, "E'aseh atzmo kemoto lidavek bidrachav," echoing the language of that pasuk in Devarim, that by acharei Hashem Elokecha telechun, we can accomplish this ubo tidbakum. And the idea there is, again, here it's referencing the midot, the character traits of God that He Himself communicated. The 13, the first, I guess the second and third of the Hashem Kel Rachav V'Chanan, the third and fourth of the attributes of mercy that God communicated directly to Moses, to Moshe Rabbeinu, when he went up onto Har Sinai, right? Moshe went onto Har Sinai twice to receive the Torah. The first time is after the Ten Commandments, after Ma'amad Har Sinai, where God spoke to the Jewish people for at least for the first two commandments to all of the Jewish people, and then gave the following 8 to Moshe Rabbeinu to communicate directly to the Jews. After which Moshe Rabbeinu went on up to Har Sinai to receive the rest of the Torah, staying there for 40 days, only to come back and see how the Jews had created and worshipped the golden calf, upon which he throws down and smashes the tablets, and then goes back up for another 40 days to beg God and to pray over and over again that God not destroy the Jews and give them another set of luchot. And finally, God acquiesces, and He does so by giving this secret to Moshe Rabbeinu and telling him, anytime that you want to appease me, come together as a congregation, as a community, and recount before me these 13 attributes of mercy. And so we see that God communicates to human beings, these are my midot. The things about God that He's describing to us, the thing about God that He wants us to know about, is these particular midot. These are the ways in which, these are the character, this is my character, so to speak. Obviously, the absolute nature of God Himself is not something that we can understand, but that God would communicate specifically these things is instructive and is telling us that this is the way in which we are to follow God. Interestingly, one of the noted ethicists, one of the noted Balei Musar of this generation, who passed away in the last 20 years, Rav Shlomo Wolbe, in his famous book Alei Shor, talks about how what we can learn from that experience, from that description of the Kriyat Yamsuf, one of the most climactic, dramatic experiences in all of the Torah, in all of the history of the Jewish people, where they go through having been saved from the Egyptians and experiencing a revelation, the likes of which not and even any of the prophets would ever reach. Ra'a shivcha layam ashalo ra'a Yechezkel ben Buzi, that they had this prophetic vision of God that nobody else in history would experience. And what did they take out of that? Becoming a better person, emulating these midot. And so the experience of God and the aspiration of following God is to take the form of these midot. And of course, that relates to social emotional learning, because number one, social emotional learning includes, broadly speaking, character education. But more basically, a person can't develop positive character traits unless they have basic social emotional competency. You can't recognize when to be compassionate. You can't, unless you're able to recognize what another person is experiencing. You can't experience compassion if you don't have empathy. You can't interact with a person in a pro-social way if you don't have basic social problem-solving skills. And so by giving our students social emotional learning, we are enabling them to become like God in this way. And coming back to Tselem Elokim, the Maharal of Prague and others bring this all around. And they say that when we're told that we're created B'Tselem Elokim, in the image of God, it is this particular thing that we are being told, that emulating God is a way of actualizing this Tselem Elokim, that this template in which we're created sets up a potential for how great we can be. And the more that we refine ourselves, the more we develop ourselves in a social emotional way and characterologically, the closer we can be to God. And that is also what we mean when we're talking about closeness to God, right? We're not talking about physical proximity. When we talk about spiritual realities, closeness is referring to approximation, similarity. The more we become like God, the more we become godly. And he takes it one step further, and that is the same way that we are created in the image of God, and the way that we have to understand that we are created in the image of God, and that's shaping the way that we are developing ourselves. We also have to understand that other people are created in the image of God as well. And these two things overlap considerably, right? Because how am I developing my Tselem Elokim? What does it mean to develop my Tselem Elokim? How do I express this development of my Tselem Elokim? By being kind to other people, by helping other people, by developing my character traits in a way that will benefit other people. Essentially, I'm developing my Tselem Elokim by relating to the Tselem Elokim of other people. And so, on one hand, because I want to bring out my Tselem Elokim, because I want to become like God, I'm seeking out opportunities to help other people. On the other hand, because I see the image of God in the other people, because I see the godliness in my fellow man, that's another thing that's bringing me to help another person. And that thing itself amplifies the Tselem Elokim in me. And so we have this feedback loop, this where I am emulating God, I'm seeking to emulate God by helping other people. And in doing so, I'm recognizing the image of God in them, and at the same time bringing out the image of God in myself. And so you have this system in which emulating Hashem affects the way that we interact with people, affects the way that we're developing ourselves, and is the context for all of our interpersonal interactions. Just reading from the Maharal, he says, Kimasha Amar Madasani Lach Lechavercha Lo Tavid, when we're told by Hillel that what is abhorrent to your friend don't do, which is in many ways an echo of the pasuk of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, loving your fellow man as yourself. So how can we do that? How can we love somebody the way that we love ourselves? But the answer is, She'ohev l'chavero kamosha hu ohev et atzmo. You love your other person just like you love yourself. That's possible because kol zeh shera'ui la'ahov et chavero mipnei shenivra chavero b'tmuto b'tzalmo. The reason that it's fitting to love another person is because that other person was created in the image of God. Umipnei sheyesh lahem dmut v'tzelem acher echad, because we share the same template, that my godliness and your godliness. Our shared godliness makes us the same, unifies us in a very basic way that goes above each of our own separate existences. ומפני שיש להם דמות בצלם אחד, הרי בצד הזה חבר והוא עצמו דבר אחד. He and his friend are one. כאשר יש להם צלם אחד לגמרי. They both are created in the very same image. והדבר שהוא במעלה העליונה באדם, הוא שיהיה לו הצלם הזה בשלמות. And the greatest thing, the greatest level that man can ascribe, can aspire to, is actualizing, fully actualizing that aspect of himself, that tselem Elokim. Va'az ha'adam, skipping down a couple of lines, va'az ha'adam hazeh tzalmo tselem Elokim. And then the person who helped the other person actually becomes an actual tselem Elokim, an actualized tselem Elokim. And I believe that that's the meaning of the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, that we're told in the Ethics of Our Fathers, where the authors of the Mishnah present their maxims by which they live, the basic kind of foundational teachings that really anchored their lives. And we're told that Ezehu michubad hamechabed et habriot, who is revered, who is honorable, somebody who honors other people. And kavod is not just to honor other people, but in the context of ananea kavod, kavod is a stand-in often for the interaction between man and God. That whenever we have the Shekhinah, whenever we have the manifestation of God, the way that we interact with it is described as kavod. And at the same time, we have these kavod relationships in this world, in our own lives. Kavod with our parents, kavod with a Torah scholar, kavod to a king, kavod to the Beit HaMikdash and to synagogues. And so all of those things are stand-ins, models, proxies for the kavod relationship with God. But coming back to the Mishnah, Ezehu mechubad hamechabed et habriot, is because in my recognizing the tselem Elokim of another person and responding to that with kavod, protecting the dignity of that person or proactively helping that other person, by being mechabed et habriot, I am bringing out my own inherent tselem Elokim, and so I become mechubad. And so, just speaking it out a little bit more clearly, we have a later Hasidic master, Rav Menachem Nachum of Chernobyl, who says in his book Me'orei Naim, "V'hinei ha'adam hamitabel, hinei ha'adam hamitdameh leborei yitbarach shemo," a person who becomes like the Creator, b'midotav, with his own character traits or with the Creator's character traits, nikra b'tzelem Elokim. לכן האדם שנברא להתאבק מידותיו נקרא בצלם אלוקים, עשה את האדם. שיהיה כמידותיו ממש, זהו עיקר פנימיות האדם. And so he says that this concept of emulating God by purifying, by actualizing my character traits to become like God, in this sense of being compassionate, being kind, clothing the naked, feeding the hungry, visiting the sick, comforting the dead. All of these things are the essence, not just of our interpersonal selves, but our pnimiut, our internal selves, that all of our spiritual strivings are encapsulated in being like God, but being like God in this very specific way of emulating his character traits and acting on those character traits and making them a part of who we are fundamentally, to the point that we are like God. And so when we teach and model positive character traits and social emotional skills, number one, we are facilitating that growth in our students. We're telling them that we're giving them the tools to become like God. And when we situate it within our broader goals of Jewish education, when we use that language of Jewish sensibilities, we are framing this as foundational Jewish values. That being a Jew means becoming like God. And becoming like God means having social, emotional, and character development. We're not just teaching this to you because we don't want you to fight. We're not just teaching this to you because the research says that, there's X degree of improvement on academic scores, and that you are more likely to be successful in college and get a better job. No, but that when the same way that we want you to be a Jew, to be a good Jew, when we're teaching you Chumash, when we're standing up and davening and praying to Hashem, we want you to have these skills also because we want you to be a good Jew. And that being a good Jew means having these skills. That it's impossible to be a good Jew without these skills, without the building blocks of becoming a Tselem Elokim. But it's one step further also. And that is, if we're told we're emulating God by copying what he does, by feeding the sick, by feeding the hungry, by helping the sick, by doing all of these things actively. What God also does is model those things, right? So we can copy God in doing the behavior that he's modeling. But doing it as a model is an even further level of emulating God. And that's something that not everybody has the ability to do. We can do that as parents. We can do that as teachers. But in explicitly teaching and explicitly modeling social emotional skills and positive character traits, we're able to step into the position of God in a way that we can't just by being kind. Being kind is being godly, but modeling kindness is being godly on an even higher level. And so when we talk about the language of Jewish sensibilities as a heuristic, as something that anchors our education, in a similar way, we have to understand we can talk about kavanah, we can talk about intentionality, and that is that we put our own practice into a context by the way that we think about it. And so teaching these things because it's part of the curriculum, teaching these things because we have a bullying problem, teaching these things because our kids can't sit in class without clobbering each other. That's great. But teaching social emotional learning because we're stepping into the position of God by modeling and by giving over these abilities transforms that practice. It gives it a much more deep foundation, context, and it can be transformative. It can also be transformative because it allows us to step out of our normal way of interacting. By connecting to this universal aspect of ourselves, the way that the Maharal described that we share this Tselem Elokim, that because I am an image of God and you are an image of God, we share this basic unity that allows us to step out of our roles. And this is something that's communicated beautifully by in a letter that Albert Einstein wrote towards the end of his life. Um, he was contacted by an ordained rabbi who had just lost his daughter at the age of 16. And he writes he was struggling with how to understand that, and she was this pristine girl who had never sinned, and how am I supposed to deal with that? And Einstein responded, a human being is part of the whole, called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole nature in its beauty. Nobody is able to achieve this completely, but the striving for such achievement is in itself a part of the liberation and a foundation for inner security. And so, what he's advocating there is connecting to the universe as a way of healing, as a way of finding comfort. But it's also a way of connecting to other people in a way that's different than we normally do. When I'm standing here and you're standing there, when I am the teacher and you are the student, if I am in the image of God and you, my student, are in the image of God, and I'm teaching you and I'm helping you and I'm doing things together with you because we share that basic unity, then I'm able to transcend myself in a very deep way. And this reminds me of a story that is in this book. Ram Dass and Paul Gorman. If you don't know who Ram Dass is, he is actually was born a Jew, and he was a psychologist, and he went off and became a guru and a Buddhist spiritual advisor, and somebody who was really influential to many people during his time. And this book is special to me because I first read it when my father gave it to me. When I started graduate school in psychology, my father gave me a copy of this book, and now as I'm recording this, I'm just a couple of days away from his 15th yard site. But over the years, I've read this book dozens and dozens of times. I can't even count the number of times I've ordered a copy to be sent to somebody or just handed somebody else my copy. And it talks about transforming ourselves as helpers in part through this awareness of our fundamental unity, in a way that allows us to step out of our roles. You know, when I'm the principal, when I'm the school psychologist, there's certain things that I do and there's certain things I don't do. Um, when I have certain fears, I have certain just limitations about this is the way we do things. And being able to connect to somebody on this very basic human slash godly level allows me to transcend that. And it doesn't mean that I'm abandoning healthy boundaries or boundaries that are necessary for my school or my organization, but it means I'm able to transcend my unnecessary limitations in a certain way. Um, and so So this book presents lots of really short stories and reflections to explore that idea. And here's one that really sticks with me. Um, as an intern, part of my work was to travel around in teams examining patients. I would notice their look as we entered, intimidated, apprehensive, feeling like case studies of various illnesses. I hated that, but I was an intern. I remember one guy distinctly, however, who was altogether different. I think this guy changed my life. He was a black man in his 60s, very cute, very mischievous, and very sick. What brought us repeatedly to him was the utter complexity of his illness, condition on top of condition, and the mystery of why he was still alive. It was so strange. We were visiting not to find out what was wrong with him, but why he was still here at all. I had the feeling he could see right through us. He'd say, "Hey, boys," when we'd come in. The way you might when a gang of 10-year-olds come barging into a house for a snack in the middle of an intense game outside. He was so pleased and so amused. It made some people nervous. I was intrigued. But for some weeks I never had a chance to be alone with him. Now and then he'd get into very serious trouble and he'd be moved into intensive care. Then he'd rally, to everyone's amazement, and we'd move him back. And we'd visit him again, and he'd say, "You boys here again?" pretending to be surprised that we were still around. One night there was an emergency, and I took the initiative and went to see him alone. He looked pretty bad, but he came alert a few seconds after I entered. He gave me a grin and said, "Well?" Sort of like he's expected me. Like he'd known how much I'd come to love him. That happens in hospitals. I imagine I looked a little surprised at the "well," but we just laughed a minute, and I stood there just so taken by who he was. And then he hit me with a single remark, half a question and half a something else. "Who you?" he said, sort of smiling. Just that. "Who you?" I started to say, "Well, I'm Dr." And then I just stopped cold. It's hard to describe. I just sort of went out. What happened was that all kinds of answers to his questions started going through my head. They all seemed true, but they all seemed less than true. Yeah, I'm this or I'm that, and also, but not just. And that's not the whole picture. The whole picture is. The thought process went something like that. Nothing remotely like that had ever happened to me. But I remember feeling very elated. It must have shown because he gave me this big grin and said, "Nice to meet you." His timing killed me. We talked for 5 minutes about this and that. Nothing in particular. Children, I think. At the end, I ventured to say, "Is there anything I can do for you?" He said, "No, I'm just fine. Thanks very much, Dr." And he paused for the name. And I gave it to him this time. And he grinned at me again. Really, he did. And that was it. He died a few days later. And I carry him around today. I think of him now and again in the midst of my rounds. A particular moment or particular patient brings him back. Who you? For years I'd trained to be a physician, and I almost got lost in it. This man took away my degree and then gave it back to me with, and also, and also, and also, scribbled across. I'll never forget that. This awareness that we relate to each other on a level that's so much higher than just our own limited roles and perspective is freeing. It allows us to really be present and show up with our higher selves and to help and to be there in a much more spontaneous way. And it frames what we're doing in either social emotional learning or all the ways in which we have to put ourselves out and respond to the needs of our students sometimes in ways that are not easy, and sometimes in by students who don't make it easy to love them and to show up for them. And so this concept of Tselem Elokim can be meaningful and transformational, not just for them and what we're teaching them, but for us and how we are there for them. And if we can foster this within our school, within our students, obviously when we talk about this being a language, that means it's a language that we speak. It has to be coming, in staff meetings, in reflecting with our staff or with our peers of what we're doing here, in orientation sessions, when we're talking about our students at the beginning of the year. I, as director of guidance, as a school psychologist, I sit down with the teacher teams at the beginning of every year, last year's teachers, this year's teachers, and I'm there for the handoff, talking about what did we learn about this student last year. And it can be such an opportunity to just dump on these kids and to talk about these are the kids that you have to watch out for, and these are the kids who are going to give you a hard time. But if we're able to explicitly in that moment talk about Tselem Elokim, or even just ground ourselves in that awareness of these students as Tselem Elokim, so we automatically bring our higher selves. We're able to relate to them as beings that are so much more than the ways in which they gave their teachers and us a really hard time. Um, and that's that's powerful. And at this point in the year, it's the end of March, at the beginning of April. We are tired, and it's the same kids who give us the hard time all the time, and the same parents who give us a hard time all the time. And so this awareness of them as Tselem Elokim allows us to step out of that and allows us to avoid some of that burnout and some of that exasperation. And as it can also help us with fostering the spiritual development of our children, because if we frame the interactions and the relationships of our students, between each other, as one of Tselem Elokim, um, then the relationships themselves have a spiritual context. And this is important because, um, there's a concept of relational consciousness. Rebecca Nye, um, in the 90s, and then over the next 10 years after that, wrote papers about this concept of children's spirituality, where she talked to thousands of children about their concept of God and their experience of spirituality, very young children. And what she came out with is this understanding that there's something inherent in children, this ability and to appreciate spirituality and to relate to the world in a way that fosters spiritual awareness, that usually by 8 or 9 is squashed, is snubbed, and we fit kids into these boxes and force them to relate to the world in ways that just kind of rob them of this. But if we're able to foster it, we're giving them tools for a mature spirituality later in life. And the way that when she put all of these interviews together and examined them for the threads that ran through them, what she found is that the experience of spirituality in young children is one that comes through relationships. A child other relationship, child God relationship, child self relationship, and a child world relationship. Being able to experience all those interactions in ways that bring out spirituality. So my connection with God, my connection to myself, and um, my my relationship with the universe, my experience of wonder and beauty, and experiencing the overarching unity between myself and other people, experiencing myself. And obviously, this isn't something for adults, especially. It's not something that we can carry around a lot. But if we make this conscious effort and we frame it for our students of we relate to each other in a way that has this godly context, and that we're unified because of our shared Tselem Elokim, that we can help somebody because they are created in the image of God. We don't bully somebody. We're not unkind to our friends because we don't do that to somebody who's created in God's image. We work on our own selves and our own midot and our own character traits because we're trying to emulate God. These are things that children are able to take in a very kind of literal way, in a way that is experienced in their their experience of reality, that becomes part of who they are, that shapes the universe that they live in, that then when they approach spirituality later in life, or as they go on with more sophisticated concepts, they're not trying to come back to and recreate these childlike awarenesses. For me, 40 something years old, to come back to this, to wonder, to come back to seeing God in rainbows, or in experiences of beauty, that's hard. But for a child, that's not. And so if we're able to foster those things and bridge it, and bring it along with them, so that our students can bring it along with them as they also incorporate these mature ideas, then we're really helping them develop this spiritual consciousness. And so, just to bring it all together, when we are grounded in our educational practice, in the concept of Tselem Elokim, then we're teaching our students as a Tselem Elokim, whatever we're teaching them. And all of the education that we do is Jewish education. We are trying to facilitate building community within the classroom, positive school climate, as an expression of godliness, as an expression of this appreciation of Tselem Elokim. And it's all rooted in Jewish education. Our own practice of helping, of teaching, of modeling positive behavior and positive character traits and social emotional learning is part of our own growth as human beings, as people who are emulating God, as Jews. And so there's growth all along the way. And again, these are things that we have to continually bring into our conscious awareness through our own prompting and our own setting intention and kavanah and mindful practice. These are things that we have to bring into our explicit language of how we talk amongst ourselves about education and about students and about what we're doing here as teachers. And it has to come into the language of how we talk to our students about how they treat one another, what we expect of each other as classmates. And it's something that's brought out in our social emotional lessons and the explicit teaching of these things, and also into our Judaism lessons, into our Torah lessons, whether that be integrating social emotional learning goals into Chumash or Halacha, or specific teaching of things like Tselem Elokim, of Ve'ahavta l'orecha kamocha, of Kavod HaBriot, as Jewish lessons in and of themselves. But by integrating these things and to making them the Jewish sensibilities that are driving what we do and are giving us our chiyus, our sense of strength, our sense of motivation as educators. These are things that can be this is a concept that can be transformative and can transform us and our schools and our students in ways that are godly. And so I bless all of us, and I wish all of us that we be able to become God, that we be able to actualize our own Selam Elohim by the way that we help our students, by the way that we do chesed with our students, by the way that we model our own midot, the way that we model the character traits for our students, by the way that we explicitly teach and gift our students with these lessons and with these social emotional competencies, with these spiritual competencies, and that this transform our schools, our own experiences, that it gives us the strength in these challenging times, to be able to overcome exhaustion and burnout and frustration and find strength and find meaning and find rejuvenation in our practice as teachers, as human beings, and as um, images of God. And may this be something that we carry with us from year to year. And thank you for participating in this session.